In the meantime, I do want to get to some of the other big stories that we are following. And of course, we do know that a big story right now is the National Guard, the deployment there over in D.C. and the potential deployment over to places like Chicago and New York City. We do have team coverage here, and I do want to start with Melanie Alnwick. She is over at Fox 5 DC, joining us now live with much more on the situation there and what we've seen. Melanie, what is the latest overall?
Well, good morning, Josh. So we're now 21 days into this federal takeover, so to speak, situation in Washington, D.C. The federal surge of law enforcement officers from many different agencies. 9 days left to go legally until this can continue unless Congress approves an extension. And yesterday, the mayor and city officials came out and said that, yes, this surge is working. They've wanted to have 500 more D.C. police officers here in the city, and they say people need to sort of embrace the additional resources to continue to drive crime down. Some people tell us they're feeling safer, but others are very anxious about seeing law enforcement in such big numbers in the neighborhoods. But let's talk about the numbers first. The federal surge again began August 7th. Now, during that time, compared to the same time period last year, carjackings are down 87%, violent crime down 45% overall, arrests are up 20%, and illegal gun recoveries are up 12%. So clearly the mayor says some things are working with extra law enforcement officers on the streets. But the mayor and the police chief say they have expressed concerns to federal partners about some tactics that they believe are damaging to public trust.
I think it's scary. It's scary to see troops and soldiers walking around. Like, in theory, they should be, a point of safety, but that's not how it feels.
We know having masked ICE agents in the community has not worked, and National Guards from other states has not been an efficient use of those resources.
Now, another focus of this D.C. Safe and Beautiful Task Force has been on homeless encampments in the city. The Trump administration says it has cleared nearly 50 of them. Today and Friday, the city is going to do a census of sorts of the unhoused population remaining in the city. The mayor says there's enough indoor shelter available in the city for those who need it, and she does want to increase bed capacity by 300. And she did have a private conversation with President Trump, which didn't elaborate a lot of that, talked about what they said their shared priorities. Of course, everybody can get behind illegal guns off the street. Everybody can get behind reductions in violent crime. So there are, as she calls it, shared priorities. But the question is, who's in charge, who's in control? And we don't yet know what shape this is going to take once those 30 days are up.
That's right. Melanie Alnwick there, Fox 5 DC. Yeah, a lot to see as the days and weeks progress. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here as always. We appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
And as we continue to follow all of the latest here on this situation, I do want to talk about the National Guard in general being deployed to, according to officials, 19 different states with this crackdown focused in D.C. However, we do know President Trump has said he wants to continue that crackdown over in places like Chicago and New York City. Let's bring in Alex Wagner, adjunct professor at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Now, he used to be the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, and he does have several other titles as well. Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and break it all down.
Good morning, Josh. How you doing? Good to see you.
Good. Thank you so much. And first off, obviously you have experience with all of this here. So I did want to ask you kind of broadly at this point what you make of this whole situation, because some are saying it is a federal takeover, quote unquote, while others are saying it's simply a crackdown on crime.
Well, the National Guard, which comprises both the Air National Guard as well as the Army National Guard in each state, has unique authorities in Washington because the DC Guard is actually controlled, and the commander-in-chief is the president, who has delegated his authorities to the Secretary of Defense and further delegated them to the Secretary of the Army. So the National Guard, the DC Guard, can do things in Washington, D.C. that the president can't ask other state guards to do in other states. And so this is a unique situation here in Washington. Of course, what are these guardsmen and women doing every day? Well, they can't be involved with law enforcement activities, so the bulk of their actions is patrolling National Mall or monuments, walking through metro stations, or sitting outside Humvees parked at our main transit hubs. The problem here is that these are students who should be going back to school in many cases, or senior executives at companies, and they're being asked to effectively show presence, but have none of the training, the authorities, frankly, the weapons training that you would expect law enforcement to have. And so effectively, it's the wrong people in the wrong situation, and it's incredibly inefficient and a waste of time.
And I will say one thing that's been discussed here. It was about a week or so ago that we learned that Pete Hegseth did confirm that the National Guard there will be carrying weapons. There were protesters that protested against it, but we did hear from Hegseth. He said this is, quote unquote, common sense. It's something that needs to happen. So what do you make of that overall as we talk about the National Guard carrying weapons to enforce really just the crime crackdown itself?
Josh, I think it belies a specific lack of experience in a senior role that Pete Hegseth would believe that. Frankly, many, if not the vast majority of Air and Army National Guardsmen are not trained in using weapons except pre-deployment. For many of them, it could be a decade or more before they've actually fired a weapon. So to arm National Guardsmen, some of which are pilots in the Air National Guard, maintainers of F-16s, some of them are accountants or admin professionals or healthcare professionals, and then to give them a service-issued weapon and say, walk around, pick up trash, don't get into any confrontations with citizens who might not be able to distinguish between masked ICE agents and now between the DC police or the Park Police or the Secret Service with this jumbled mission is a recipe for disaster. Typically, law enforcement professionals, which are police officers, have training in the use of firearms. And the training that these guardsmen may have had in the use of firearms is highly unlikely to be recent and even more unlikely to be relevant to the role they're being asked to play.
When we talk about what happens next here, President Trump has said that he does want to deploy the National Guard and other folks there to places like Chicago and New York City, where he wants to reduce crime. Again, he is calling this a crime crackdown. What do you think that will look like? But also, when you have the D.C. mayor saying that this is actually reducing crime, does that just give more of, I guess, a push for the same thing to be done in places like New York City and Chicago?
Well, Josh, I'm not sure we actually can attribute the reduction in crime to the presence of the National Guard sitting in Humvees on the National Mall or trying to get shade in metro stations and our subway. The key thing is, how are you using America's men and women in uniform? And the way I see it is this is a real abuse, but the president has the authority with respect to the DC Guard inside of Washington, D.C. As soon as you get outside of Washington, the commander-in-chief of every state's guard, whether it be Baltimore and the Maryland National Guard, whether it be Chicago and the Illinois National Guard, would require the president to either invoke the Insurrection Act, which says that there's an armed insurrection against the United States of America in these American cities, or ask the Guard to federalize the Guard and ask them to do things like traffic safety and the like. So the Guard's role in law enforcement is unclear. The Guard's training in law enforcement across America is minimal at best. There are certain specialties within the Guard. In the Army Guard, you would call it military police. In the Air National Guard, you'd call them security professionals, security forces, but this is a very small career specialty. The vast majority of these people have absolutely no training or understanding in law enforcement, but they do know what the law of war is, and they're trained in the law of war. And when you put the Guard in American cities where the enemy is their own community, that is something that strains the relationship between their commanders in chiefs, which is their governors, and the White House and the administration. Again, it is such a gross misuse of the Guard, a gross misuse of American taxpayers' resources, and again, frankly, shows a lack of understanding between this JV Secretary of Defense, the lowest ranked chairman of the Joint Chiefs in history, who also, by the way, happens to be an Air National Guardsman himself. And so to allow this to occur on his watch, I think is just an absolute shame. This is the first chairman who comes from the Air National Guard. The first chairman, I believe, whoever comes from the National Guard in general. And so if he's not willing to stand up to the White House and advise what the proper role is, no one seems to be able to do that. And that allows the White House to not be able to distinguish between law enforcement and professionals who are trained in the use of lethal force.
Alex Wagner, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and provide that perspective there. We definitely appreciate it. Anything else that you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
I just want to say thank you to America's National Guard and the men and women in the Army and the Air National Guard. We all know that you're being asked to do things that you can't do easily, and yet every single day you get out of bed and do what America and what your chain of command asks you to do. So thank you, even though America recognizes that this is not what you want to be doing and it's not what you have training to do.
All right, Alex, thank you again for being here this morning. We definitely appreciate it.
Appreciate it, Josh. Thanks so much.